We've been talking about Kant and laying out the first version of the categorical imperative that he gives. Act only on that maxim you can at the same time will as a universal law. That is to say, any moral judgment really has to be universalizable. You have to do the same thing in all like cases. Now, what exactly makes a case like another case is complicated. But at least we can say this first principle, the formula of universal law, is based on the idea that any moral judgment does have to be fully general, fully universal. So I can't say, aha, stealing is wrong for you, but it's okay for me. I can't say murder is wrong for you, but okay for me, etc. I've got to say this across the board. And I can differentiate maybe different kinds of killing or different kinds of taking, but those are going to have to be differentiated on the basis of things we think matter, okay? Pertain to whether or not we could actually formulate a principle that we could apply to everyone and every similar case. Now, before we go on to the other formulas, maybe it's worth reflecting a minute on the fact that this does have some real implications, not only for us as individuals, but for organizations. So if we think for a moment about what this means for an organization, for a group of people, what does it imply? What's going to follow from this? Yeah?
You should set out special criteria for specific people that you should have a universal set codes.
Okay, good. You're going to have universal principles for dealing with people. You can't deal with different people differently. So, for example, suppose you're talking about your employees. What would this imply? In a company, let's say. That's right. Pay everybody in the same job the same, for example. Or have a criteria that apply to everybody. Maybe you don't want to apply or, treat everyone in the same job the same. But on the other hand, you would have to find ways of differentiating. Like maybe you create a career path so that people, even though they're doing the same work, get paid gradually more as they're there more years, etc. Whatever you do, it has to be something you apply across the board. You can't say, this job is worth more for you, less for this person, okay? Unless there's a real differentiation that you want to recognize and that you're willing to apply across the board. Now, when you start thinking of things this way, you realize, yeah, you have to have policies that apply quite generally. You have to give people equal treatment in a sense. You have to guarantee them, well, the equal protection of the laws, as the 14th Amendment has it. You have to have rules that are universal. And remember, this is motivated by the thought that the law is universal. It has to apply to everybody in a given category. Now, that's going to imply that some categorizations are legitimate ones and others aren't. So in particular, to say, well, I do recognize that things matter according to category. There's the category of Dan Bonnevak, and then the category of everybody else, right? That's going to be illegitimate. It's like, yeah, that's not a thing. You can't draw that distinction between me and everybody else. But what are some other distinctions? Basically, the task we face then is saying, look, certain kinds of distinctions are relevant distinctions. And certain other kinds of distinctions are irrelevant. So we start thinking then, well, how do we know, right? Now, Kant doesn't throw up his hands and say, oh, I don't know. He says, well, can we universalize it, right? This me, as opposed to everybody else thing, could I universalize that? Can I say things are okay for me, but not for you? You're going to say, well, things are okay for me, but not for you, right? And so it's quite clear that we immediately encounter some kind of contradiction there. But he thinks other kinds of things are going to turn out to be irrelevant. So one thing that will be irrelevant is anything that you might say has to do with specific persons. We can't single out one individual person and just say me or Dan Bonnevak or whatever. That's something that is not going to fly here. And that does have some important consequences. Right? The king cannot say, I, Louis XIV, have special rules applying to me. Now, maybe he can say, the king has special rules applying to him, but it has to be for any king. It can't be just for him. Other things that would be irrelevant. Yeah.
Special treatment of specific race.
Okay, good. So we might have racial classifications, for example, as things that would appear at any rate to be irrelevant. Now I say would appear to be irrelevant. Why do I say that? Well, because there are circumstances that, even in very strict interpretations of the law, would actually count as legitimate uses of this, right? For example, you're a movie director, and you're making a movie about Malcolm X, and some Irish guy applies, right? you can think, wait, no, I don't want some Irish white guy playing Malcolm X. And conversely, you could have a movie you're making about Winston Churchill, and a black actor applies. And you think, well, no, Churchill was this white guy. And so there are things that under the law are recognized as bona fide occupational qualifications. And sometimes race is actually one of those. But now in almost all other contexts, it's not true, right? Let's say the band needs a new saxophone player. You can't say, well, the saxophone player has to be white, or has to be black, or has to be any other particular thing. Though you could, if you were, again, doing a movie about Charlie Parker and his band in the 1940s, say, I want people who reflect the races that the people really were in that movie, and so on. But on the other hand, if you were just doing a sort of recording, I mean, you can't employ such discriminations. And the same thing is true across a very wide area. Of course, there are controversial areas, things like affirmative action and other things, where it becomes unclear, maybe, and people fight about whether race could be a legitimate category there. What are some other things that we at least take presumptively to be irrelevant? Oh, sorry.
Economic class.
Okay, good. Economic class. We tend to think that's irrelevant, right? I mean, suppose we're interviewing for a professor's position at UT. Can we say, well, where did you grow up? Did you go to a public high school or a private high school, and so on, and use a decision on that basis? Now, it's not illegitimate for us to ask. It might come up in conversation, but that can't be a criterion. That would be illegitimate. And there are all sorts of other contexts where, to find out, so what were your parents like? What did they do, et cetera? Do you come from old money or new money or no money? No, that's not cool, right? And we shouldn't treat people differently on that basis. What are some other things that would appear to be irrelevant? Yeah?
For race, could we say like disabilities?
Okay, disability. Now, in general, that's something we can't count as legitimate. Again, there could be bona fide occupational qualifications. So let's say we are hiring somebody to be a pilot. We don't have to give equal consideration to a blind person or a sound engineer. We don't have to employ one with a serious hearing disability because it's really relevant to the job. But if it's not relevant to the job in that way, or if we can accommodate this, then we have, by the way, I did have a sound engineer for a while who was basically deaf. It's a problem. It's a real problem. Anyway, yes.
Maybe we might as well just list the rest of the equal employment.
Well, okay, good. We can start listing all of them, right? I mean,
Gender, national origin.
Yeah, exactly. So all of those things, what is that all about, right? I mean, those things are taken to be presumptively irrelevant. So the thought is, look, we need a special story if we're to explain why this is relevant to our classification. And maybe in some cases we can give that special story, but ordinarily we think these are out of bounds. That's why under the law, these are given strict scrutiny, which is to say, it's not like they could never actually be legitimate, but the presumption is they are not, and you have to show a compelling interest to override that presumption that they're irrelevant. On the other hand, in our organization, we might think lots of things are relevant. Let's go back to that question about pay and think about pay scales. Presumably these things are irrelevant. We can't say, oh, well, sure you get paid more because you're of a certain race, or sure you get paid more because you're male or because you come from Germany or whatever it is. However, we can give certain kinds of answers. So what are some things that would be relevant to that? Yeah.
Experience in the field.
Good, experience would be relevant. We can say, but you're just starting out. That person's been doing this job for 10 years and is highly experienced. Or what are some other things we could?
Education.
Education. Yeah, often people get a higher salary for having an additional degree. Other things, yeah.
Agreeability.
Agreeability, yeah. Some people are easy to get along with and add to the group, right? Other people are really difficult. And that can have a huge impact on the group. And you might think, look, this person, they do their job well, but they're a pain in the butt. They annoy everybody else. Now, is that a legitimate thing? In some jobs, you might think it's really not. In other jobs, it might be crucial. It depends on how much group dynamics matter. Yeah.
I guess like a specialty.
Ah, okay, good. Sometimes people have a specialization, which just commands a premium. There aren't many people who do that, right? And so that specialization is something that says, well, look, this person, they aren't just a generalist who does blah, 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 blah. They really excel at this particular thing that we need. Yeah.
Performance.
Performance, yeah, how well are they doing? Somebody can say, hey, these two people are doing the same job. Yeah, but that one does it a lot better. My daughter was shocked to find out that in her job classification, there are actually like 300 people who do the general kind of thing she does in her organization. And she does something like 3 or 4% of the work of the entire group. So she does the equivalent of 30 to 40 people. Doesn't mean she gets paid anymore because it's a state agency, but nevertheless, it's kind of like, wow, okay. But that's the kind of thing you could recognize with salary differences. Other things. Yeah.
Interpersonal skills or communication.
Okay, good. Communication skills. There are people who not, in fact, I've known faculty members who are like this. Part of their contribution is actually in helping and educating everybody else. Having that person in your department just helps everybody else do a better job. They talk, they're easy to talk to, they help you solve problems, and it's not just true at universities, it can be true in any organization. That's the person everybody goes to when they have a question about something. And those kinds of communication skills and interpersonal skills and building up everybody else and helping them do their job is a really positive thing. On the other hand, if everybody finds somebody difficult to work with or difficult to communicate with, or if they're constantly throwing roadblocks in your way and make it harder to do your job, even if they're doing okay in what they do, they may be, in effect, negatively impacting a lot of other people. Anything else? Yeah?
Tenure, company loyalty.
Ah, okay, yes, loyalty. The reason I snicker is that that sort of cuts both ways, because a lot of places have what they consider longevity pay or a loyalty bonus or something like that, where you've been there a certain number of years, you get a special bonus for having been around, to give you an incentive to stay there. On the other hand, in a lot of organizations, there's sort of a loyalty tax. You don't really keep up with the marketplace until you get another job offer. And then all of a sudden, it's the people who come in new, fresh, who are actually being paid market salaries, and they're way above everybody else. So the less easy it is to move around, the more that kind of penalty for loyalty actually takes place. In universities, that's a real problem. The people who have been here a long time are often radically underpaid compared to the people who come in more recently, and it's because of that. It's like, yeah, you're here, you're probably going to stay here, so who cares? We'll give the money to that person we want to hire from the outside. And it's not just in universities. That happens in a lot of organizations. So you would think, wait, that's perverse, right? Isn't it a good thing to be around a long time? But often it turns out not to be. Yeah?
I'm not sure how to phrase this, but like value generated, like how, you might be as good at your job as Tom Herman, but he gets paid more.
Okay, yeah. Value generated. Some people might just be in a position where they do the job just as well as this person over here, but this person, because of the nature of their job, is generating a lot more money than this person, okay? And that's just because that position, like, is more crucial to the company, maybe. Or maybe they just do it in a way that actually produces a lot more revenue for the company. They actually are doing things, the way they do it actually generates income. So the way that operates in a university, for example, especially in the sciences, is some people get a lot of grants. Other people may be just as good at their science, but what they do doesn't generate a lot of grants. And that person who brings in a lot of money through grants is going to be rewarded for that, even if this other scientist is every bit as good as a scientist. Other things, yeah.
What about a criminal record?
A criminal record. Ah, yeah. Of course, it's not just a criminal record. You might say any kind of past, you know, like getting fired from an earlier job for whatever reason can end up having an effect. Why does that kind of stain, you might say, on the record persist? It's because people think it adds to the risk of hiring you. And so you have a criminal record, or let's say you 10 years ago were fired for a certain position, not entirely clear why, but you know it wasn't just because the company was having to lay off people, and you think, there's some story there, I don't even know what it is. Not criminal in that kind of case, but still you say, the risk seems higher in this case. So yeah, there is again a debate about the extent to which these kinds of things ought to count and how long they ought to count. It would be weird to think that, gosh, you know, you got arrested once for possession of marijuana back when you were 17, and now you're applying for some job at age 55, and they say, oh, he's a big risk, man. But on the other hand, you know, in certain, if you find out, you have this criminal record of, you know, child molestation, and you're applying for a job in a daycare center, you might think, yeah, that's kind of bad. And so, anyway, there can be degrees of riskiness that you think that creates in this particular job. Other kinds of things that you might agree are relevant. Yeah?
How much you work, like if you're full-time or part-time?
Ah, good. Yeah, just hours worked. If somebody says, why don't I get paid as much as that person? So, well, you're only 20 hours a week. That person's 40 hours a week. That's an obvious explanation. Yeah?
I'm curious, like, I guess for, like, a elementary school or something, they don't want you to have, like, tattoos all over you. Is that, I would think that would be relevant in some, like, the way that you look, I guess. Like, it should be relevant.
Ah, yeah. Okay, appearance. Now, some aspects of this people think are legitimate and others illegitimate, right? There's a fight about the boundaries. But surely there is some relevance to this. Now, we tend to think, look, actually there's research that shows that tall people tend to earn more than short people, that good-looking people earn more than ugly people, etc. And most of us think, yeah, that's kind of unfortunate. On the other hand, there might be certain, there is a guy who has made his face look like a tiger. And he's had extensive plastic surgery and has, you know, and you would think, yeah, I don't know how I feel about that. Now, if this guy's a computer programmer who's sitting over there in some cubicle and doesn't interact with anybody, you might think, I don't care if his face makes him look like a tiger, that's cool. But suppose he's applying for a job as a public relations person. You might think, yeah, you know, unless our mascot is a tiger and we think it's cool, right? We're the Cincinnati Bengals, then maybe we say, yeah, hire this guy. But otherwise, we sort of say, yeah, I think this is a problem, right? I don't know, what would your reaction be to me as a professor if my face looked like the face of a tiger? There's this Japanese company now that actually has started making replicas of your pet's head that they're made into a mask and you can put them on so that you can look just like your cat or dog, and you know, and you don't have to. You don't have to send them the literal pet's head. I mean, you send them photographs, so you can actually like put on this mask and then go up to your cat Otis and say, "Hey, Otis," and it's like, oh, look just like Otis. Well, suppose I just got obsessed with this and came in every day looking like a different cat. With this. That would be disturbing, right? I can imagine the university saying, look, stop that. And if I refused to stop it, it would get me in trouble. Or conversely, what if I dressed terribly inappropriately? And I don't know exactly what the boundaries of that are for a professor. When I was young, most professors wore suits and ties. Now, at least at our university where it's hot, most people don't do that. But on the other hand, there are boundaries to the way we dress. I don't come in gym shorts and sweaty t-shirts, although I've seen professors do that. One of my colleagues I team taught with one term used to wear flip-flops. And students were deeply offended by the flip-flops. I mean, most of his negative student comments were about his footwear, which is like, wait, what?
That's just because they're flip-flops, not because the professor wearing flip-flops.
I'm surprised it was the
Maybe. No, it was the student. I mean, nobody in the department cared, but the students were upset about this,
Did he
And
have gross feet?
Is he like a hobbit?
no, there was nothing weird about his feet. I think it was that we were up on a stage. It was one of these big classes, and a lot of people were looking directly at foot level, so they became obsessed with the flip-flops and stuff. I don't know. Anyway, whatever that. Presumably there are boundaries for almost any job about what an acceptable appearance is. And if you deviate from that, people do think it's relevant. Within those bounds, people think it's okay and shouldn't count. And sometimes the boundaries are kind of unclear and people fight about them with dress codes and so on. Yeah?
Speaking of appearance and race, let's say there's a Midwestern restaurant in Austin and they say, listen, we want to get the authentic Midwestern look, and that's why we're hiring only white people to be the waiters. Like Asian restaurants hire Asian people sometimes.
Yeah.
Is that considered a relevant distinction, and how would you demarcate that?
I mean, see how well that worked for Paula Dean.
That's pretty disturbing, right? Could that be a bona fide occupational qualification?
I mean, Hooters only hire girl servers. Like, if I wanted to work at Hooters, I couldn't be a girl.
That's a good point, right? That's an interesting question. I don't have a view about that. I mean, the Midwestern thing makes me feel very uncomfortable. But if somebody else said, look, this is a Jamaican cafe, we want to hire Jamaicans, we don't want to hire a bunch of white guys going around saying, hey, man. I kind of get that. And so, I think that's an interesting and...
What about a Swedish restaurant that says, like, listen, it doesn't matter if you're necessarily Swedish, but you got to have blue eyes and blonde hair.
Yeah, right. I don't know.
That applies anymore in Sweden.
Right, yeah. I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. I think there are, even with race, which, at least in the United States, is the paradigm of something presumptively irrelevant. As we saw, there are some cases where people find it acceptable, but it's a very narrow class. But even on the bounds of that, there is a lot of controversy. So, the kind of case you're mentioning seems disturbing and notice they're much more disturbing in some contexts than others. So what are the boundaries of all of that? I don't know. And of course, here we're talking about it within the organization. Presumably, if I'm somebody interacting with an organization, I can legitimately say, gosh, I like this restaurant because it seems authentic, because it's a Mexican restaurant that everybody who works there is Mexican and speaks Spanish. And that doesn't seem like, well, you're discriminating, if I'm out on the outside. So, on the other hand, if it's inside, and that place says we'll hire only Mexicans, that seems more dubious. So, anyway, I think it's hard to sort this out. Yeah?
I feel like the relevant stuff is a lot more fluid, especially like the restaurant stuff. And like banks, they don't hire people with bad credit. So, it's the same thing with like the money thing with class and stuff. So, I think there's a lot more fluidity with that.
Well, that's a good point. Class And income level and so on, we tend to think should be irrelevant for most purposes. But when you're applying for a loan, we don't think it's irrelevant. Well, class maybe is, but the amount of money you have, how much collateral you have, you know, how big a risk you are, seems relevant.
They won't even hire you if you get this.
That's true. They won't even hire because you're going to be around quantities of money. The danger of embezzlement is too high. And so you're right. There are places where we say, look, it's partly things like a criminal record, but partly something like, or I mean, suppose we are in an organization where we interact with the wealthy. Maybe you're trying to be a real estate agent at Sotheby's or something, and you're specializing in the market of $1 million plus homes. And you're going to be interacting with people who are very wealthy and often upper class people. Let's say you're applying for this job in the Hamptons, and you speak with a strong accent, right? You are from a lower class background. Here in the United States, this isn't nearly as big a thing, but it's a very big thing in Britain, for example, and even here it sort of is. I come from a part of the country where people have a very strong accent, and so suppose somebody actually has that accent. In fact, it's consistently voted as the ugliest English accent anywhere in the world when people actually test this sort of thing, which luckily is rare. But you know, if I, still speaking the way I did when I grew up and the way my grandparents did and so on, were to be in that situation, it would be very strange, right? It would be bad that instead of saying, you know, meeting one of these wealthy people and saying, how do you do? I said, how yin's doing? That would not be good. Or imagine somebody who's from Brooklyn, you know, and hey, you guys, that would be a problem. Maybe. Now, maybe the person pulls this off with such aplomb that it seems charming rather than, you know, jarring to a certain person. But nevertheless, you might think, oh, no, you must be able to interact with a certain clientele at a certain level, and that requires at least being able to fake being of a certain class. Okay, well anyway, enough on this. It's a complicated question. It's going to depend what our organization is, what we're doing, not only what ends up here and what ends up there, but what the boundaries look like. Now, all of this is based on the thought that a person of goodwill is motivated objectively by the law, right? And the law is universal. But there is another path to thinking about what a person of goodwill is. And I think it's much more intuitive. So here's the way it goes. We're looking for something that applies to all rational beings as such, as rational beings. We're not looking for anything that depends on any subjective considerations, any particular goals or values you have, any means that you choose to select to achieve those goals. We want something that's going to apply to anyone. Now, is there anything that all rational beings value? Yeah. Agency, that's right. Their own rational agency. You care about various ends, whatever they are, and they can vary. Even happiness can vary. Some people put happiness at the top of their list, as Aristotle or the utilitarians do. Other people say, no, for me it's not about happiness, it's about service to others, or it's about communion with God, or it's about seeking justice, or it's about something else. So in any case, whatever it is, people pursue different ends, but they all value their ability to attain their ends. What do we call that ability to choose means to attain ends? Rationality. So rational nature, Kant says, exists as an end in itself. Every rational being necessarily values rational agency. So if that's true, rational beings, qua rational beings, all value rationality. And you're absolutely right. That means they value choice. They value agency. They value the ability, in other words, to choose means reasonably, rationally, to attain ends. So now we don't actually have to say, and we don't have to give in to Hegel's complaint that actually this is all kind of empty. All the work here is being done by what we put in this category and what we put in that category, because the law just tells us act universally, but on the basis of what, right? And you might think putting things down here or in here, that's already, now I think he's wrong about this, but he would say, oh, that's something else. That's not coming from this idea of law as universal. But Kant says, well, there's something else anyway. It's not just that the law is universal. It's that every rational being values rationality, okay? You can't say, well, yeah, of course I want things the way anybody wants things, but I don't care whether I ever get them. What would that mean? I don't value my own ability to get them. That's absurd, right? It's like saying, yeah, I like good food, but I have no interest in actually obtaining it. Or, sure, I greatly value education, but I don't care whether I get it or not. What would that be like, right? Of course you value your ability to get what you want, whatever that is. Now, if that's true, Kant says, that tells us something important. Because that says we have something we all share. And it allows us to put in an end. Now, not happiness, not something like that, but instead we can say, and he calls this version of the categorical imperative the formula of humanity. Basically, every rational being has to treat every other rational being as an end, not as a means only. So he says, treat humanity as an end in itself, never merely as a means. Now, that merely is really important because we use each other all the time. You're using me right now to learn about Kant. I'm using you to get paid. Okay? And we do that all the time, right? I mean, you go to the store, you buy something, you're using that checkout person as a means to get what you want. And they're using you as a means to get a paycheck and so forth. So the economy depends on using people as means, hence Marx's complaint that it's fundamentally unjust. But leave that aside, Kant would say, well, no, I'm not saying that that kind of thing is fundamentally unjust. Using people merely as a means, that's the unjust part. So, for example, what we're doing now is a voluntary exchange, right? It would be different if I went out into the street with a pistol and held it up to various people and said, you want to learn about Kant, don't you? Right? They said, no, not really. Well, yes, you do. Come in here, sit down. Okay, stay there. You'll be shot if you leave. Then I'm denying your rational agency. I'm not giving you a choice, right? But if I respect your ability to choose, then it's fine. You can take the course. You can not take the course. That's cool. You can come to UT, you can not go to UT. That's fine. And so as long as both parties are interacting voluntarily as agents, things are fine. Now really to understand then what the boundaries are here, we need to know when I would be using you merely as a means. So think intuitively for a moment. What are some cases where you could say, it feels like that person's being used, not in a perfectly fine, mutual, voluntary way, but in some other way where we'd say they're being used just as a means. They're not being respected. In fact, a positive way of putting this is to say respect people. Don't use them. Yeah?
I know some people that go on dates just so they can get a meal.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. Some guy asks you out and you think, I don't like this guy, but he's offered to take me to this really nice restaurant and I've really been wanting to go. So sure, right? That seems like just using somebody. Other examples. Yeah.
Lying to somebody, to get them to do something under false pretenses.
Good, lying to somebody. Okay? You wouldn't want to do this, but I'd lie to you to convince you to do it. That example of lying seems to suggest, yeah, I'm manipulating you, right? I'm using you merely as a means to get what I want. I'm not treating you as an end in yourself who gets to make your own free, rational choice. Other examples. Yeah?
If you came into class and didn't teach us, but still
Oh, good. Suppose I came in and didn't teach you, but got paid for teaching you, okay? Now, how could that happen? Well, I might come in and just do other things. I actually had a professor who one term came into, I was the assistant, so I sort of had to take over teaching this class, teaching him the actual content, because he was on the edge of a nervous breakdown. And he was reading this autobiography of Jonathan Slocum, the first person to circumnavigate the globe alone. And he just came into the logic class and told stories from this. Slocum is now at Tierra del Fuego, and here's what happened when he interacted with the natives and so on. And it's like, these people then come into my discussion section, and they're like, we have logic homework, and all we know about is what happened to Jonathan Slocum and the Tierra del Fuego. And so I had to sort of teach the class. And yeah, that would be an example where, in this case, it wasn't that he was trying to use the students. I think he really was in trouble mentally at that term. He became convinced that he was going to take the sailboat that he took out on Lake Erie and actually sail to Hawaii and try to circumnavigate the globe alone, but he was going to start by sailing to Hawaii from Pittsburgh. And a friend, was saying, look, I don't understand how you're going to do this. I mean, this was before GPS and all of that, right? And so, and here was his explanation. Well, it's easy, right? You just get in the river, and I mean, it's all sort of downstream. So you just go down the Allegheny and down the Ohio and down the Mississippi, and then you're in the Gulf of Mexico. But look, it's not too hard to figure out where south is, and so you just go south and through the Panama Canal. How you do that in a sailboat, I don't know. But anyway, then the other professor he was talking to said, well, how do you get to Hawaii? And he said, oh, that's easy. You just bring a little transistor radio. And you sail toward the setting sun until it brings in some of these Honolulu rock stations, and then you just sail so they get louder and louder. Well, anyway, then he was given a year off, and so in any event, yeah, that kind of thing is bad. Or the scandal at the University of North Carolina, another example. A professor was on record as having taught 70-some classes over a period of 2 years. And you're like, wait, he taught 70 classes in 2 years? How is that possible? And then you find out, well, wait, most of them never actually had any meeting time. And like, who was signed up in all these classes? Oh, a bunch of people who actually never turned in any work. And who were those people? They were athletes. And anyway, it was a big scandal. But in any event, that kind of thing can happen. And it does feel like people being used. Who's using whom is sometimes unclear, as in that case. But nevertheless, it feels like, yeah, something's going badly wrong. Now, if we add up all these cases together and think, what do they have in common? We get something like John Stuart Mill's account of agency. And Mill is the one who really spells this out in detail, but I think Kant and other people quite a bit earlier already had this concept. What is it to be a rational agent of an action? What's required? Well, think about the negative thing. One case here we had was, wait, you're being forced into something, right? You're being coerced into it. So we have to say, look, you're doing this freely. You're making a real choice here. Secondly, think about the lying case, the deception case. In that situation, you might say, wait, you don't know what you're doing, so you have to be informed. You have to actually know what you're doing. Now, there are other sorts of things, too. After all, you might think, well, yeah, coercing me, that's surely using me merely as a means. Not lying to me, deceiving me, that is using me merely as a means. But what about the case of the professor who doesn't teach? Part of the reason I went into the story in a little detail is to say, well, he wasn't really forcing students into anything, right? But on the other hand, were they informed? They weren't deceived exactly, except they took the class to learn logic and then weren't being taught logic. And so you might think, wait a minute, there's a sense in which this doesn't require active deception. It's just that key information is not being provided to you. You're under a false impression. Maybe there's a situation where you naturally assume something's going to happen, and then it doesn't happen. You go into the restaurant, you sit down, and nobody ever comes to wait on you, right? You might think, well, I'm not exactly, nobody said, we'll come wait on you in a minute, and then lied. But you think, I had a reasonable expectation that somebody was going to actually like take my order. And if you sit there for an hour and no one does, you might think, yeah. Actually, if you don't pay any money, I don't see how you're being used as a means either, but there's something bizarre about that. So what other conditions are part of agency? Yeah.
I have a question about the rational being valuing agency of all else. It doesn't seem self-evident to me. I mean, a rational being, for example, gives up his or her agency to own nuclear weapons for some other reason. So it's not clear to me that we're always valuing agency.
Okay, good. There are circumstances in which you give up your ability to freely or informedly choose things. So what are some circumstances where you actually give up some degree of agency? Yeah.
I mean, technically just entering society as a whole, you have to give up agency. Like, the part of the social contract is like, I have a representative in Congress, so I don't have any agency with that person. Like, they do something for me.
Right.
Like that.
Okay, good. You might say just being in society involves giving up a certain amount of freedom to choose. Actually, laws are imposed upon you. You're under a general political authority. And that being under that authority, if it's legitimate, seems to involve, well, whether it's legitimate or not, involves denying your agency. We tend to think if you do it voluntarily, as with this idea of social contract, then it becomes okay. And really, you might say, look, it's a general problem about contracts. Every time you enter into a contract, you're giving up some freedom, right? You get married and you're promising fidelity to a certain person. You're promising other things. You're giving up a certain amount of freedom. But it's true when you enter into a contract for employment, or you offer to work for somebody as a plumber to fix some problem, or you, for that matter, hire the plumber. In those cases, you're giving up a certain amount of freedom. You're contractually binding yourself to do something. Now, this is why some philosophers from Thomas Hobbes on have thought about the question of voluntary slavery. It's an odd thing. It's not like we've had legions of people in the past who become voluntary slaves. However, it's because they're interested in finding the boundaries of your ability to give up your own freedom and to give up your own agency. And mostly they've said, look, you can't give it up so completely that you actually sell yourself into slavery. However, if that's illegitimate, what are the bounds of this? Can you just never give it up? That seems wrong. You don't want to say all contracts are illegitimate. So what are the boundaries? And one way of doing this is to say, well, actually Mill confronts this question at the end of On Liberty. He says, look, all contracts do involve some sacrifice of liberty. But we think it's fine as long as you enter into the contract voluntarily and as long as you can get out of it. So he thinks of it this way. What's wrong with voluntary slavery is that you're eliminating the liberty and the rational nature of your future self. As long as you leave your future self an out, it's okay. So he thinks contracts have to be written so that they are not unbreakable, so that there is a way of actually getting out of the contract later. There may be a penalty for that. Might be like, okay, yeah, you can get out of the contract, but you're going to have to pay the following penalty. Okay, that's all right. But it can't be an unbreakable contract. Anyway, yeah.
But there was something where you're informed and you think it will be an outcome, so you act freely in that way, but then it ends up not being the case. So it's a different outcome than you were informed.
Oh, well, absolutely. So it might be that you think all of this is going to produce a certain outcome, and it doesn't, right? So it's not, there's one case where you're really deceived, but another case you're just wrong. So you go into it thinking you're about to get this outcome out of it, and it turns out that's not the case. Like you agree to let the doctor bleed you back in 1600, thinking that will get rid of the bad humors, and instead it kills you. You weren't intending to bring about your own death, but you pretty seriously did compromise your future rationality. And so what do we say about cases like that? You didn't, in fact, know what you're doing. So we can think, yeah, it's not just a question of knowing, it's a question, or rather, of having someone tell you. It's partly a question of knowing. We can't say you freely chose to die in that case. And there are a couple of other things we could say, just to finish off quickly. One is we can say, the act has to be voluntary. Another way of putting this is, it really does have to be the outcome of a choice. We don't want coercion, but we also don't want to count the consequences of your sneeze as relevant, or of your sudden projectile vomiting, or whatever it is. My daughter was conducting the Georgetown Honors Choir last night, and they had a crisis because a student, whether it was because of the heat of the stage lights or nerves or whatever, in the back row suddenly threw up all over the place. Okay? So if you look at my little video of one of the songs, there's this strange gap right in the middle. You can think, why aren't there any students in the middle? The answer is because that area had to be evacuated due to a sudden vomit crisis. Well, that's, if you go to that student and say, that was some way to exercise your rational nature. No, it was not a voluntary choice. She wasn't coerced. It's not that she didn't know what she was doing. It's that, it was involuntary. And similarly, somebody has to be competent to choose. We don't tend to think that children, for example, have full rational nature and deserve the same degree of respect as adults. All right. Next week, we're going to talk about consequentialism, but before we leave Kant entirely, we'll reflect on the implications of this and Kant's other frameworks for organizations, and then see why you might think that's not enough, and we need something further that consequentialism gives us.